The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic, hypnotic drone, a sound as much a part of the Iowa landscape as the cry of a red-tailed hawk. It rolled across the muddy farmyard, over the heads of men in seed corn caps and insulated coveralls, a cadence of financial ruin. Eli Miller stood near the back, hands shoved deep in the pockets of his worn canvas jacket, his presence quiet as a fence post. He wasn't here to bid, not really. He was here to watch, to learn, and to scavenge. A man could always use a spare set of cultivator shovels or a decent log chain, and a farm auction was the place to get them for pennies on the dollar. This was the Henderson place. 400 acres of prime black dirt, sold. 2 years ago, Bill Henderson had been the talk of the county, showing off a brand new John Deere 4430, the one with the sound guard body, a space-age bubble of air-conditioned comfort. Now that tractor, barely broken in, sat gleaming under the pale March sun, a green and yellow monument to ambition that had outrun the rain. The bank was taking its pound of flesh. Eli's gaze drifted from the tractor to a figure holding court near the auctioneer's truck. His cousin, Richard. Richard wasn't bidding either. He was spectating, a smug satisfaction playing at the corners of his mouth. He was dressed in a clean Carhartt jacket, a fresh-from-the-box International Harvester cap perched on his head. He gestured with a soft, uncalloused hand toward the Henderson farmhouse. "See?" Richard's voice carried on the wind, loud enough for those around him to hear. That's what happens when you try to run a modern farm with yesterday's thinking. Bill was a good guy, but he was always a day late and $1 short. Never invested enough, never expanded fast enough. Eli felt a familiar, dull ache in his gut. Richard's words weren't just about Bill Henderson. They were a backhanded sermon aimed squarely at him. A year had passed since Eli's father, old Thomas Miller, had been laid to rest in the churchyard on the hill. The reading of the will had been a simple affair. To Richard's father, his brother, Thomas left his set of antique woodworking tools. To Richard, a crisp $100 bill. But to Eli, his only son, he left everything else. The 320 acres of Miller land, the house his great-grandfather had built, the barns, the grain bins, the livestock, and the machinery, all of it, free and clear. Not a single penny owed to any man or any bank. Tucked inside the deed was a handwritten letter, the paper worn soft as a flannel shirt, the pencil script faded but firm. "Son," it read, "this land has fed our family for 4 generations. It doesn't owe us a living. We owe it our lives. I leave it to you without the burden of debt, for debt is a chain a man forges for himself, link by link, with every signature. These new men, they talk of leverage and credit like it's a new kind of fertilizer. It is not. It is a poison that sours the soil of a man's soul. A man who owns his land and his tools sleeps soundly. He is a king on his own soil. Never forget that. The bankers are not your friends. They are merchants of hope, and they charge a steep interest." Eli had folded that letter and placed it in the family Bible, but he had the words branded onto his heart. His inheritance of iron was a testament to his father's philosophy. The flagship of his meager fleet was the 1951 Farmel M. Its red paint faded to a dull orange, a testament to 20 years of sun and seasons. There was the John Deere 60, the Johnny Popper, with its distinctive 2-cylinder thrum that you felt in your teeth. For harvest, he had an old pull-type Alice Chalmers All-Crop 60 combine, a machine that required patience and a deep understanding of its mechanical quirks. They were old, they were slow, and they were paid for. Richard, by contrast, had embraced the new religion of leverage. His father sold him the adjoining 480 acres on a family contract, but then co-signed a loan at the Story County Bank that made old man Henderson's debt look like pocket change. The very next week, a flatbed truck had delivered a brand new international harvester, 1066, a beast of a machine with a turbocharged diesel engine that screamed where Eli's tractors rumbled. It had a fully enclosed cab, a radio that played WMT out of Cedar Rapids, and an air conditioner that blew cold air while Eli baked on the steel pan seat of his farmall. Richard had a new 6-bottom plough to go with it, a 20-foot disc, and a 12-row planter. He was the poster boy for what the farm journals were calling the new agriculture. The auctioneer's cry of "sold" broke Eli's thoughts. The 4430 went for a price that made several men around him whistle low. The bank would get its money back, and then some. Bill Henderson, standing by his wife, looked like a ghost, his face pale and drawn. He had lost his legacy in a single afternoon. Later that week, as Eli was greasing the zerks on his old John Deere disc, a cloud of dust announced a visitor. Richard's new Ford pickup, shiny and blue, pulled up to the fence line. Richard leaned out the window, a styrofoam cup of coffee in his hand. "Mornin', cousin," he said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "Richard," Eli acknowledged, not stopping his work, the grease gun making a satisfying pop as it filled a joint. "Saw you at the Henderson sale," Richard said. "Sad thing, that. Real sad." He took a sip of coffee. "You know, Eli, I've been thinking. You're working yourself to the bone with this old junk. I could make your life a whole lot easier." Eli stopped and wiped his greasy hands on a red rag. "How's that? Let me custom farm this place for you," Richard said, gesturing across Eli's fields. "I'll have your ground ploughed, planted, and sprayed in a week. You wouldn't have to lift a finger. You could sell this scrap iron for what it's worth, put a little money in your pocket. Focus on those hogs of yours. It's the smart play, Eli. Efficiency. That's the name of the games now." The offer hung in the air, thick with condescension. He wasn't offering to help. He was offering to erase Eli's way of life, to declare it obsolete. "I appreciate the offer, Richard," Eli said, his voice even. "But my father's ways worked for him. They'll work for me." Richard let out a short, sharp laugh. "Your father's ways? Eli, your father farmed in a different century. This is 1969. We've been to the moon. You're trying to win the Indianapolis 500 with a horse and buggy. You're living in the past." "Maybe the past has a few things to teach us," Eli said, turning back to his disc. Richard shook his head, a look of pity on his face. "Suit yourself. But when you're still planting in mid-May, while the rest of us are cultivating, don't say I didn't warn you." He put the truck in gear and sped away, leaving Eli alone in a swirl of dust and the quiet dignity of his work. Eli watched him go, the smell of diesel fumes tainting the clean spring air. He knew what they said about him at the co-op, at the feed store. They called him stubborn, backwards, a fool. They said old Thomas Miller had been a great farmer in his day, but he'd saddled his boy with a museum full of junk and a head full of dangerous, outdated ideas. Maybe they were right. Maybe Richard, with his shiny new iron and his line of credit, was the future. Before we get deeper into this story, I have to ask you all something. Have you ever had someone in your life, maybe even family, who looked down on you for being careful with your money, for sticking to the old ways that you knew worked? Let me know down in the comments, because Eli was living that reality every single day, and the planting season was about to put his father's wisdom to its greatest test. The first week of May brought a perfect planting window. The soil was warm and dry, crumbling just right in Eli's hand. The days were long and sun-drenched. Across the fence, Richard's 1066 roared from dawn until well after dusk, its powerful halogen lights cutting through the twilight. The whine of its turbo was a constant, irritating reminder of Eli's own deliberate pace. In 3 days, Richard had all 480 of his acres planted in corn. He was done. Eli, meanwhile, was on day 4 and had just over 100 acres in the ground. He was pulling his old John Deere 494 planter with the Farmall M. It was a good, reliable setup, but it was slow. The M topped out at about 5 miles an hour in 3rd gear, the perfect speed for planting. The rhythmic click-clack of the seed plates dropping kernels into the soil was a sound he'd known since he was a boy, riding on the fender next to his father. He was on the last pass of the North 80 when it happened. There was no warning, no sputter, no cough. The engine just died. One moment, the steady, throaty roar of the 4-cylinder engine filled the air. The next, there was only the sound of the planter units rolling through the dirt and the chirping of sparrows. Eli pushed in the clutch and coasted to a stop. He knew the feeling instantly. It wasn't fuel. He'd checked that an hour ago. It was spark, the sudden, total silence of a dead ignition. He climbed down from the steel seat, his boots sinking into the soft, tilled earth. He popped the cap off the distributor. Nothing looked amiss. He pulled a plug wire, stuck a spare spark plug in it, and laid it against the engine block. He climbed back up and hit the starter. Nothing. Not a flicker of a blue spark. He felt a cold dread creep into his stomach. It was the magneto. For a modern farmer like Richard, this would be a minor inconvenience. He'd get on the 2-way radio in his cab, call the dealership, and a mechanic in a service truck would be out within the hour with a new part. For Eli, it was a crisis. Every hour of this perfect weather he lost was an hour he could never get back. He didn't have a radio. He didn't have a dealership on speed dial. He had only himself and the tools in his father's barn. He unhitched the planter in the field and managed to get the M to roll down a slight incline and back onto the headland. From there, he hooked a chain to the front axle and towed it the half-mile back to the farmstead with his old Chevy C10 pickup, the truck straining and the tires digging for traction. He pushed the dead tractor into the barn, the scent of old hay, engine oil, and manure a familiar comfort. He rigged up a trouble light, its single bulb casting long, dancing shadows across the concrete floor. The workbench against the far wall was his father's creation, built from heavy oak planks and stained with the ghosts of 1,000 repairs. This was where the real work of farming happened. With a set of well-worn wrenches, he carefully removed the magneto. It was an International Harvester H4, the original unit that had come with the tractor. He carried it to the bench like a surgeon carrying a vital organ. The outside was caked with a mixture of grease and dirt. He cleaned it carefully with a rag soaked in kerosene, the sharp smell filling the barn. Then, with a small screwdriver, he opened it up. Inside, it was a miniature world of delicate springs, copper windings, and precise gears. He saw the problem immediately. The condenser, a small metal cylinder, had a hairline crack in its casing, and the breaker points were pitted and burned, the tungsten contacts worn down to almost nothing. The machine had finally given up its ghost after nearly 2 decades of faithful service. He didn't have spares. His father had been meticulous about keeping parts, but a magneto was a specialized item. He'd have to go to town. He looked at the clock on the wall. 4:30. The parts store in town closed at 5. He wouldn't make it. The repair would have to wait until morning. A full day and a half of planting, gone. He leaned against the workbench, the cold, heavy magneto in his hand, and felt the full weight of his situation settle upon him. Out in the darkness, he could hear the faint sound of a television from Richard's house, a world away. The next morning, He was at the door of the Napa Auto Parts store in town, before the owner, Gus, had even finished turning the sign to open. Gus was a man in his late 60s, with hands permanently stained black, and a deep knowledge of engines that predated the computer chip. "Morning, Eli," Gus said, unlocking the door. "What breaks on a fine day like this?" "Magneto on the M gave out," Eli said, placing the unit on the counter. Gus whistled. "An H4. Haven't seen one of these come in for a rebuild in years. Everybody just swaps them out for a distributor conversion kit these days." "I just need points and a condenser," Eli said. "Want to keep it original." Gus nodded, understanding. He disappeared into the cavernous back room, the sound of shifting cardboard boxes echoing in the quiet store. A couple of other farmers came in, their faces familiar from the coffee shop and the sale barn. "Hey, Eli," one of them, a man named Dave Peterson, said. "Still running that old M? I thought you'd have traded that thing for a boat anchor by now." "She still runs good," Eli said quietly. "Most of the time." "Heard Richard got all his corn in Monday," the other farmer chimed in. "That new 1066 of his is some kind of machine. Said he was going to start planting his beans today." The words hung in the air. Eli was halfway through his corn, and his cousin was already starting on his second crop. He could feel their eyes on him, a mixture of pity and condescension. He was the county curiosity, the young man trying to farm like his grandfather. Gus returned with a small box. "Found 'em. Last set I got. You're in luck." Eli paid in cash, thanked Gus, and left, the small talk of the other farmers following him out the door. The 20-mile drive back to the farm felt like 100. He spent the rest of the day and most of the night in the barn, under the stark glare of the trouble light. He worked with a surgeon's focus. He carefully installed the new points, his fingers, though thick and calloused, moving with surprising delicacy. He set the gap with a feeler gauge, sliding the thin strip of metal back and forth until the friction was just right, 14/1000ths of an inch. He installed the new condenser, making sure the connections were clean and tight. Reinstalling the magneto was the hardest part. He had to get the timing perfect. He turned the engine over by hand with a large crank, feeling for the compression stroke on the number 1 cylinder, lining up the timing marks on the crankshaft pulley. He seated the magneto, making sure the rotor was pointing to the right terminal on the cap. It was a slow, frustrating process of trial and error. Adjust, tighten, check. Adjust, tighten, check. Finally, around midnight, he was ready. He climbed onto the seat, took a deep breath, and pulled the starter rod. The engine turned over, once, twice. It coughed, a cloud of black smoke puffing from the exhaust stack. He adjusted the choke and tried again. This time it caught. The rough, sputtering cough smoothed out into the familiar, beloved rhythm of the Farmel M at idle. The sound was sweeter than any music. He let it run for a minute, the bare bulb overhead vibrating with the engine's pulse. It was a victory, hard won and solitary. But as he shut it down, and the silence of the night returned, he looked out across the dark fields toward Richard's property. He had won the battle with the magneto, but he knew, deep down, he was still losing the war. The next few years were a blur of hard work and tight margins. Eli stuck to his father's plan. He farmed his 320 acres, rotating corn and soybeans, raising a small herd of hogs in the old barn. He kept his machinery running with skill, baling wire, and sheer determination. He paid his bills with cash and put what little was left over into a savings account. He was solvent, but he wasn't getting rich. Then, in 1972, the world changed. News trickled into the heartland of a massive grain deal with the Soviet Union. The Russians, facing a disastrous harvest, were buying American wheat, corn and soybeans on an unprecedented scale. The effect on commodity prices was immediate and explosive. Corn, which had hovered around $1.50 a bushel for years, shot past $2, then $3. By the harvest of '73, farmers were getting nearly $4 a bushel at the local elevator. An intoxicating gold rush fever swept through the Corn Belt. For men like Richard, it was the vindication they had been waiting for. With his high-capacity equipment, he was perfectly positioned to ride the wave. He brought in record yields and sold them at record prices. The money flowed like water. He paid down a chunk of his operating loan, but the banker, Mr. Henderson, a man with a perpetual smile and an eye for opportunity, had other ideas. "Don't be in such a hurry to pay off that debt, Richard," Henderson advised him over coffee at his big mahogany desk. "That loan is your tool. With land prices going up 20% a year and corn at $4, you're losing money by not borrowing more. This is the time to expand. Get big or get out." It was the siren song Thomas Miller had warned of, but to Richard it sounded like a heavenly choir. He took out another loan, a massive one this time, and bought the 160-acre farm that bordered his property to the west. The price per acre was astronomical, double what it had been just 3 years prior, but nobody seemed to care. The thinking was that it would be worth even more next year. With the new land came the need for even bigger equipment. Richard traded in the 1066, which was only 4 years old, for a brand new international harvester, 1466. It was a monster, with dual rear wheels, a more powerful engine, and a cab so quiet you could hear the radio clearly over the roar of the diesel. He bought a new Gleaner L combine with a 6-row corn head, a machine that could harvest more in an afternoon than Eli's All-Crop 60 could in 3 days. Richard was no longer just a successful farmer. He was an agricultural tycoon, the talk of the county. He and his wife bought a new Lincoln Continental and took a 2-week vacation to Hawaii, sending postcards back to their friends. Eli, too, benefited from the boom. The checks he got from the co-op were the biggest he had ever seen. For the first time in his life, he had a substantial amount of money, but his father's words echoed in his mind. "Debt is a chain a man forges for himself." He saw the frenzy around him, the new pickups in every driveway, the talk of buying more land, bigger tractors. It felt brittle, unreal. Instead of leveraging his newfound capital, he fortified his position. He used the money to re-roof the big barn, a job that was long overdue. He put new tires on the Farmall M and the John Deere 60. He bought his seed and fertilizer for the next season and paid for it in full, taking advantage of the cash discount. He replaced the old wiring in the house. The rest, a significant sum, went straight into his passbook savings account at the Story County Bank, earning a modest 5% interest. His discipline was not seen as wisdom, it was seen as madness. At the co-op, while waiting to unload his grain, Richard cornered him. "I just don't get you, Eli," Richard said, shaking his head in genuine disbelief. He was tanned from his Hawaiian vacation. "You're sitting on a gold mine and you refuse to dig. You could buy that 80 acres south of you, get yourself a decent tractor. You're acting like this is all going to end tomorrow." "Things that go up have a way of coming back down, Richard," Eli said simply. Richard laughed, a loud, booming laugh that turned heads. "There he goes again. Old man Thomas talking from the grave. Eli, the world has changed. We're feeding the world now. The demand is endless. These prices are the new normal. You're probably just burying your money in coffee cans out behind the barn." He clapped Eli on the shoulder. "Can't teach an old dog new tricks, I guess, or a young dog taught by an old one." One afternoon, late in the fall, Eli went to the bank to deposit his final grain check. The lobby was busy, filled with the optimistic buzz of the boom. As he waited in line, he overheard Mr. Henderson talking with another farmer, Frank Gable, who was signing a thick stack of loan documents. "Now this note is a variable rate, Frank," Henderson was saying smoothly. "But don't you worry about that. The prime rate has been stable for years. It's just a formality." "Variable rate?" Frank asked, a flicker of concern on his face. "It just means the rate can fluctuate with the market," Henderson explained, his voice a reassuring purr. "But with corn at $4 and land values climbing the way they are, you can't lose. It's the best way to finance your expansion." Eli felt a cold knot tighten in the pit of his stomach. Variable rate. The words sounded dangerous, unstable. He thought of his father's letter, of the warnings against merchants of hope. He made his deposit, the teller stamping his passbook with a satisfying thud. The number in the balance column was solid, real, and his own. He walked out of the bank into the bright afternoon sun. The town square was bustling. New cars lined the streets. The storefronts looked freshly painted. There was a feeling of endless prosperity in the air, a party that would never end. But Eli couldn't shake the feeling of deep, instinctual unease. He looked at the prosperous town, at the farmers driving by in their new, expensive trucks, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that a day of reckoning was coming. Trees don't grow to the sky, and what goes up must, eventually, come down. He just didn't know how hard the fall would be. The good years, as everyone later called them, lasted until the very end of the decade. The grain flowed, the money rolled in, and the party seemed like it would never stop. Then, on a cold day in January of 1980, the music died. The president, in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, announced an embargo on grain sales to the USSR. The news crackled over the AM radios in tractor cabs and farm kitchens across the Midwest. The primary customer for America's agricultural bounty was, in an instant, gone. The effect on the markets was catastrophic. The price of corn, which had been comfortably over $3, plummeted. It fell through $2.50, then $2. By spring, farmers were lucky to get $1.75 a bushel, a price that didn't even cover the soaring cost of fuel and fertilizer. The gold rush was over. For Eli, the news was a heavy blow. It wiped out his profit margin, and then some. But as he sat at his kitchen table, figuring his costs on a yellow legal pad, a grim sense of relief washed over him. His costs were manageable. His biggest expense was diesel fuel for the tractors, but the old Farmel and the Johnny Popper were fuel sippers compared to the new turbocharged behemoths. He had no loan payments. He had no machinery payments. He had his savings in the bank. It would be a lean year, perhaps the leanest of his life, but he would survive. For Richard, the grain embargo was the first crack in the foundation of his empire. His entire operation was built on the assumption of high commodity prices. His loan payments to the Story County Bank were calculated on $3 corn. At $1.75, he was hemorrhaging money with every acre he planted. Then the weather turned against them. The spring was dry, and the summer that followed was brutal. The sun beat down from a hazy, merciless sky. The corn, stressed from lack of moisture, grew stunted and pale. The leaves curled in on themselves by midday, a desperate attempt to conserve what little water they held. By July, deep cracks spiderwebbed across the fields, wide enough to swallow a wrench. The drought of 1980 was settling in like a fever. Eli watched his crops suffer, a familiar ache in his heart. He did what he could, cultivating carefully to keep the weeds from stealing moisture, but he knew he was at the mercy of the heavens. His yields would be a fraction of normal. Across the fence, Richard was fighting a losing battle on a much grander scale. His new, heavier equipment compacted the dry soil, making it even harder for the rain to penetrate when the occasional brief shower did pass through. One blistering afternoon in August, Eli was out mending fence when he saw Richard's massive Gleaner L combine, parked at a strange angle in the middle of a soybean field, a plume of black smoke hanging over it. Richard was standing beside it, his hands on his hips, staring at the machine as if it had personally betrayed him. Eli walked over. "Trouble?" he asked, his voice carrying over the shimmering heat waves. Richard didn't even look at him. "Hydraulic pump went out," he said, his voice flat and exhausted. "Took the main drive with it. Puked fluid all over the field." Eli whistled softly. That was a catastrophic failure, the mechanical equivalent of a massive heart attack. On his old all-crop 60, a breakdown meant a busted belt or a clogged auger, something he could usually fix in an hour with the tools he carried in his pickup. "Called the dealership in Ames," Richard continued, kicking at a dirt clod. "They said they might be able to get a mechanic out here by Friday. Friday? I've got beans shattering in the field, and they're talking about Friday. Said they're swamped. Everybody's new junk is breaking down in this heat." He finally turned to look at Eli, his eyes bloodshot with stress and lack of sleep. "The pump alone is $3,000. God knows what the labor will be." $3,000. It was more than Eli had spent on parts in the last 5 years combined. He saw the panic behind Richard's eyes. This wasn't just a breakdown. It was another crushing, unexpected expense in a year that had no room for them. "I've got a couple of hydraulic jacks if you need them," Eli offered quietly. Richard just shook his head and turned back to stare at his dead machine, a monument of chrome and steel that was now worth less than nothing. The first cracks were widening into fissures. The banker, Mr. Henderson, was no longer smiling. His office, once a place of easy credit and optimistic projections, now felt like an interrogation room. Richard sat across the big mahogany desk, the bank's quarterly statement in his hand. The numbers didn't make sense. "What is this?" Richard demanded, pointing a trembling finger at the interest payment. "This is double what it was last quarter." Mr. Henderson adjusted his tie. His voice, once a reassuring purr, was now cold and clinical. "It's the variable rate, Richard. I'm sure you recall we discussed it. The Federal Reserve is raising the prime rate to combat inflation. It's at 14% now. Your loan is prime plus 2. 16%. The number hung in the air, an impossible, suffocating figure. 16%? Richard stammered. How is anyone supposed to make a living paying 16% interest? "The bank doesn't set the federal policy," Henderson said, steepling his fingers. "We're all feeling the pinch. I'm going to need you to make a payment against your principal, Richard. Your debt-to-asset ratio is getting out of line, especially with land values starting to soften." Richard walked out of the bank in a daze. The world he had built, the world of endless growth and easy credit, was dissolving around him. He was a captain on a ship he could no longer steer, caught in a perfect storm of collapsing prices, devastating drought, and crippling interest rates. That fall, he brought in a harvest that was less than half of his average, and he had to sell it for a price that barely covered his fuel bill. He was, for the first time, facing the terrifying reality that he might lose it all. He was becoming Bill Henderson. The winter of 1981 was bleak, but it was only a prelude. The farm crisis, which had been a gathering storm, broke with full fury over the next few years. The prime interest rate, in its relentless war against inflation, climbed to an unimaginable 21%. Farmland, the bedrock of the agricultural economy, lost 60% of its value in some areas. Farmers who had borrowed heavily against their equity in the 70s woke up to find themselves bankrupt on paper, their debts dwarfing the value of their collateral. The headlines in the Des Moines Register told the story in stark, black and white print. Foreclosures mount across Stater. Another farm family forced out. The friendly smiles were gone from the faces in town. The local dealerships, once bustling with farmers ordering new equipment, were now quiet repositories of repossessed machinery. There was a sickness in the land, a plague of red ink and broken dreams. For Richard, the end came in the fall of 1983. He had fought for 2 years, restructuring loans, selling off livestock, deferring maintenance on his equipment. He worked with a frantic, desperate energy, but it was like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teaspoon. The bank, itself under pressure from federal regulators, finally called his loans, every last one of them. The foreclosure notice arrived by certified mail. Richard's wife found him in the machine shed, sitting on an overturned 5-gallon bucket, staring at the massive 1486 tractor that had once been his pride and joy. The notice was crumpled in his fist. He was a broken man. The swagger was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed despair. The empire he had built on a foundation of debt had crumbled into dust. Eli heard the news at the feed store. The auction bill was already tacked to the community bulletin board, a stark white sheet announcing the forced sale of 640 acres, late-model farm machinery, and household goods. The name at the top was Richard Miller. Eli felt no satisfaction, no sense of vindication. He felt only a profound sadness for his cousin, for his aunt and uncle, for the piece of the family legacy that was about to be scattered to the winds. While his neighbors were going under, Eli survived. The drought years were hard, and his income was a pittance, but his discipline during the boom years had been his salvation. His savings account, which Richard had once mocked, became his lifeline. It allowed him to buy fuel and seed, to pay his property taxes, to live. He ate from his garden and butchered his own hogs. He patched his own tires and welded his own broken parts. The Farmall M and the John Deere 60, symbols of his backwardness, became symbols of his resilience. They required no expensive computer diagnostics, no $1,000 hydraulic pumps. They required only grease, fuel, and a farmer who understood their simple, honest mechanics. He lived by the words his father had written. A man who owns his land and his tools sleeps soundly. While the nights of his neighbors were filled with the terror of looming bankruptcy, Eli slept the deep, untroubled sleep of a free man. He was a king on his own soil, a small, quiet kingdom in a world that was on fire. He wasn't rich, he wasn't powerful, but he was solvent. And in the heartland of the 1980s, that made him a rare and fortunate man. He knew the auction was coming, and he knew, with a heavy heart, what he had to do. The day of Richard's auction dawned grey and cold, a fitting sky for a funeral. The farmyard was packed, just as it had been at the Henderson sale years ago, but the mood was different. The giddy optimism of the boom was gone, replaced by a somber, fearful silence. The faces in the crowd were haunted. These men weren't here just to watch a neighbor's demise. They were here to stare into a mirror of their own possible future. Eli parked his old Chevy pickup along the road and walked up the long lane. He saw Richard's new equipment lined up in a neat, funereal row, polished and gleaming under the flat light. The 1466, the Gleaner Combine, the Lincoln Continental. They looked like artifacts from another civilization, monuments to a faith that had failed. He found Richard standing near the house, talking to the banker, Mr. Henderson. Richard looked 10 years older than he had the last time Eli had seen him. His shoulders were slumped, his face a mask of weary resignation. Henderson, in contrast, was all business, his face impassive as he went over the auction procedure. He gave Eli a curt nod, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, perhaps a grudging respect for the one who got away. Eli didn't go to Richard. There were no words that could soothe a wound this deep. Instead, he sought out the auctioneer. He found him by the clerk's trailer, going over the sale bill. "Morning, Earl," Eli said. The auctioneer, a man who had sold off half the farms in the county, looked up. "Eli, didn't figure on seeing you here." "I'm not here for the machinery," Eli said. "I'm here for the land. When you get to the real estate, I want you to offer the home quarter separately, the 160 acres with the house and the buildings." Earl raised an eyebrow. "The bank wants to sell it as a single parcel. They'll get a better price that way. An outside investor is more likely to buy the whole section. The Miller family has farmed that quarter for almost 100 years, Eli said, his voice quiet but firm. It shouldn't be sold to an investment group from Chicago. Offer it separately. I'll make it worth your while." There was a weight in Eli's voice, a sense of authority that came not from arrogance, but from a deep, unshakable certainty. Earl looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Eli. I'll do it." The machinery sold for pennies on the dollar. The mighty 1466, which Richard had paid over $50,000 for, brought just 18. The combine went for even less. It was a bloodbath. With each fall of the gavel, another piece of Richard's life was stripped away. Finally, Earl climbed onto the hayrack to sell the land. "All right, folks," he boomed, his voice echoing across the silent crowd. "At the request of the family, we're going to offer the home 160, Parcel A on your maps, separately first." A murmur went through the crowd. Mr. Henderson, the banker, looked up sharply, a frown creasing his face. "What am I bid for 160 acres of prime Story County farmland, with house and outbuildings?" Earl began. The bidding was sluggish. A few local farmers made tentative offers, but the prices were painfully low. The land crash had destroyed everyone's confidence. The bidding stalled at a price that was an insult to the generations of work that had gone into the place. "Do I hear another bid?" Earl chanted, his eyes scanning the crowd. From the back, a clear, steady voice called out, "Yes." Every head turned. Eli Miller stood with his hands in his pockets, his expression calm. He named a number, a price significantly higher than the last bid. It was a strong, serious offer. A hush fell over the crowd. Mr. Henderson's jaw tightened. A speculator in a suit and tie, representing an out-of-state investment firm, countered Eli's bid. Eli immediately raised him. The two of them went back and forth, the bids climbing steadily. The crowd watched, transfixed. This wasn't just an auction anymore. It was a battle for the soul of the community, the faceless money from the city versus the local man with dirt under his fingernails. Finally, the speculator shook his head and stepped back. The price was too rich for him. He was buying a number on a spreadsheet. Eli was buying back his family's legacy. "Sold!" Earl's gavel fell with a crack that sounded like a rifle shot. "To Eli Miller!" Eli didn't celebrate. He simply nodded, then turned and walked toward the house. He found Richard on the back porch, staring out at the fields that were no longer his. Richard's wife was beside him, her arm around his waist. "Eli," Richard said, his voice choked with emotion, "you didn't have to do that." "It's Miller land," Eli said simply. "It needs to stay Miller land." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It was a rental agreement. "I'm not set up to farm this place and my own too. I need a good tenant. The rent is 1/3 of the crop, just like in the old days. You can stay in the house as long as you want." Richard stared at the paper, then at his cousin. The rivalry, the jealousy, the years of mockery, all of it melted away in that one moment of profound, unexpected grace. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, tears welling in his eyes for the first time that day. He wasn't just being saved from ruin, he was being given back his dignity. The years that followed were a time of slow healing, for the family and for the land. The farm crisis eventually receded, leaving deep scars on the landscape and the people. Many had lost everything, but the Miller farms, side by side, endured. Richard, humbled and changed, became a different kind of farmer. Without the crushing weight of debt, he rediscovered a love for the work itself. He and Eli became partners in a way they never had been before, sharing labor and equipment, helping each other through planting and harvest. The whine of a turbocharged diesel was replaced by the steady thrum of Eli's Johnny Popper and the throaty roar of the old Farmel M, which now worked fields on both sides of the fence line. The other farmers in the county, the ones who had survived, looked at Eli with a new understanding. They saw that his father's wisdom wasn't about being backwards, it was about being resilient. It was about understanding that farming wasn't a sprint to get rich, but a marathon of survival. They started coming to his machine shed, not to mock, but to ask for help fixing their own aging equipment, which they could no longer afford to replace. One crisp October evening, years later, Eli stood on the hill behind his house, looking out over the two farms. The corn was harvested, the fields were clean, and the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. His son, a boy of 10, stood beside him. "Grandpa Thomas was smart, wasn't he, Dad?" the boy asked. Eli smiled and put a hand on his son's shoulder. "He was," Eli said. He knew that the land doesn't care if your tractor is new or old, red or green. It only cares if you respect it. And he knew that the worst chains are the ones you can't see. He reached into his wallet, where he now kept the letter, its paper as soft as cloth. He unfolded it carefully and handed it to his son. The boy took it, his small hands holding the legacy of 4 generations. He began to read the faded pencil script, his lips moving silently in the twilight. Eli looked out at the land, his land, paid for not just with money, but with patience, with discipline, and with the quiet wisdom passed down from a father to a son. The rhythmic drone of the auctioneer was a distant memory. In its place was the gentle whisper of the wind through the corn stubble, a sound of peace, a sound of permanence. It was the sound of a man who was truly free, a king on his own soil.